Beneath the roar of an Atlantic storm, a man and his dog reached a house clinging to the cliff's edge, a home the sea had tried to bury in silence. But why would a dead father leave behind a place that still glows after 12 long years? What truth sleeps behind those locked doors? And what price will his son pay to wake it? Jack, a weary veteran haunted by wars he couldn't forget, came searching for closure. But what he found on that cliff would test more than his courage. It would test his faith in people, in love, and in second chances. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and if you believe in stories that heal, hit subscribe. The morning air rolled in thick from the Atlantic, carrying the scent of salt and rust. Fog drifted across the worn docks of Portland, Maine, swallowing the shapes of fishing boats and street lamps until the world looked like an unfinished painting. The gulls cried faintly in the mist, and somewhere beneath the gray water, the tide clawed at the shore like an impatient secret. Jack Miller tightened his coat and stared again at the letter in his hand, its edges creased from hours of handling. The paper was thick, official, the kind of document people received when something ended or began again. His name was written in fading ink, though the signature at the bottom was fresh enough to make his heart stumble. Henry Miller. Henry, his father, dead 12 years. Or so everyone said. Jack was 47 now, still broad-shouldered despite the hollow look behind his eyes. His short hazel hair was touched with silver at the temples, and a thin beard traced his jawline like a memory he refused to shave away. He moved with a soldier's care, as if each step still carried the weight of old battlefields. Once, he'd been a Marine. Now, he was just another man trying to make sense of what was left when the uniform came off. The letter had arrived that morning, slipped through his apartment door in a plain envelope with a return address he didn't recognize. Whitmore and Hayes, attorneys at law, Portland, Maine. Inside, it read that he was the sole heir to a coastal property registered to his late father, located on a stretch of land called Widow's Point. Jack reread the last line. "We advise that you come in person to claim the estate. The property is unoccupied, but secured." He'd read those words a dozen times, but they never sat right. His father had died in what was called a vehicular accident, a car found twisted at the base of a cliff, the sea having swallowed most of what was left. No body recovered, only Henry's watch and a torn scrap of his jacket, stained with salt and oil. Jack remembered standing by the crash site, waves breaking violently below, the air thick with disbelief. Now, 12 years later, that same father had just left him a house. A low bark broke his thoughts. Beside him, Max stood alert, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that shimmered like weathered bronze. His amber eyes followed Jack's every breath. Max had been assigned to him during his final years in service, a therapy dog for soldiers living with PTSD. But to Jack, he was far more. Max had been the reason he got out of bed some mornings, the reason the nightmares didn't win. Jack knelt and rubbed the dog's neck gently. "What do you think, buddy? Someone playing a cruel joke?" Max tilted his head, ears twitching. Jack exhaled. "Yeah, I don't buy it either." He slipped the letter back into its envelope and stared out over the harbor. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing faint outlines of the sun, boats moored in the bay. Somewhere out there, past the horizon, was Widow's Point, a name his father had mentioned once when Jack was a boy. Back then, Henry had worked for a research company called Hydrowave Technologies, specializing in environmental engineering and water treatment. Henry used to talk about the future like it was something he could build with his hands. "Clean water for everyone, Jack," he'd say, eyes bright behind his glasses. Then came the day the optimism stopped. Jack remembered his father's silence after dinner, the the way he began locking his home office door. His mother had called it pressure from the company. But Jack had always felt there was more to it, the kind of silence that meant fear. He could almost hear the tune Henry used to whistle while soldering copper pipes in the garage. Low, steady, unhurried. That sound had once meant safety. The letter in his hand was proof of that fear, resurrected. He folded it carefully and stood up. The decision settled inside him like a stone in calm water. He was going to Widow's Point. By noon, Jack had packed his truck, an old Ford that still carried the scent of oil and sea salt. Max jumped into the passenger seat without needing to be told. As the truck rumbled out of Portland, the city gave way to rolling countryside, then to dense pine woods that swallowed the road in shifting shadows. He drove with the window cracked open, letting the cold air sting his face awake. The radio played softly, static intercut with a preacher's voice speaking about forgiveness. Jack turned it off. Forgiveness had never come easy to him. Not for what he saw overseas, not for what he couldn't save, and certainly not for a father who had left him with more questions than love. After 2 hours, the GPS lost signal. A wooden sign loomed through the fog. Widow's Point, private road. The path wound upward, hugging the cliffs. Pines leaned inward as though whispering secrets about those who passed beneath them. When the trees thinned, the Atlantic opened up in front of him, a vast, restless gray. And there, perched on the edge like a secret too heavy to bury, was the house. It wasn't the kind of ruin he had imagined. The structure was modern, angular walls of glass and stone, its surface weathered but intact. Seagrass grew wild around the edges, and gulls nested along the roofline. The property looked alive, yet forgotten, as though time itself had decided to look the other way. Jack parked near a rusted gate and stepped out. The wind cut across his face, smelling of salt and iron. Max trotted ahead, nose twitching. The gate creaked open with surprising ease, as if someone had oiled it not long ago. Jack paused, scanning the cliffside. The only sound was the surf colliding with rock far below. Whoever had maintained this place hadn't wanted it to look cared for, but hadn't wanted it to decay either. He walked to the front door, heavy oak, reinforced, its brass handle dulled by years of sea air. It opened smoothly under his hand, the hinges whispering rather than groaning. Inside, dust floated in the thin shafts of light, spilling through the wide glass panels. Max padded ahead, nails tapping on the floorboards. Jack followed him through the open living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows faced the endless horizon. Furniture was minimal. Leather chairs, a bookshelf lined with binders, a large drafting table covered in yellowing blueprints. The smell of old paper mixed with sea air. On the table lay a photograph. Jack picked it up. It showed his father, younger, standing beside a woman Jack didn't recognize. Tall, sharp features, blonde hair tied back, wearing a hydrowave jacket. The back of the photo read, Hydrowave Coastal Survey Team, 2010. Jack's stomach tightened. 2010 was the year before his father's death. He turned toward the shelf. Several binders bore labels in Henry's precise handwriting. Water sample logs, discharge test data, correspondence, internal. Whatever Henry had been working on, it wasn't personal tinkering. It was corporate and deliberate. Max's low growl broke the silence. Jack turned sharply. The dog stood by a closed door near the hallway, fur bristling, ears pinned. "What is it, boy?" Jack approached cautiously. The door was locked, secured with an old padlock. He knelt and examined it. Though rusted, the dust around it had been recently disturbed, and a faint footprint lingered near the threshold. Something metallic glinted in the half-light. Jack knelt and picked up a small tag, dull with age, its edges green with corrosion. He wiped away the grime until the engraving showed through. Property of Hydrowave, Lab Unit 4B. His pulse quickened. Hydrowave again. The same company that had claimed Henry's death was an accident. Jack straightened slowly, the old Marine instinct surfacing. Someone had locked this door for a reason. And if his father had left this house to him, maybe he wanted Jack to find whatever was behind it. He looked back toward the window. The Atlantic stretched endless and gray, the surf breaking violently against the rocks below. For the first time in years, Jack felt something unfamiliar, not hope, but the raw edge of purpose. He turned to Max. "We'll come back tomorrow with tools. If he left something here, we'll find it." Max wagged his tail once, as if to say he'd already decided that hours ago. Jack walked through the house once more before leaving, scanning the walls, the shelves, the little details only a son would notice. The neat handwriting, the half-finished sketches of filtration systems. Everything about the house spoke of a man who hadn't planned to die. As he stepped back into the wind, Jack caught his reflection in the glass door, older, rougher, but with his father's eyes. Maybe that was why the letter had come to him. Maybe Henry knew Jack would come looking, no matter how much it hurt. He closed the door gently behind him, feeling the weight of ghosts settle in his chest. The fog had returned, rolling in from the sea like a memory too heavy to stay buried. The morning broke through a gray veil of mist, soft light sliding across the glass walls of Widow's Point. The cliff house stood in defiance of the sea, its sharp edges nearly invisible against the pale stone around it. Pines crowded close, their roots gripping the cliffside like fingers refusing to let go. From afar, the house seemed less like a building and more like something carved by the wind itself, an echo of its surroundings, hidden from the world. Jack parked the truck beside the narrow path where salt grass brushed the doors, the sound of the surf below rumbling like distant thunder. Max leapt down first, nose pressed to the ground, tail steady, his breath clouding in the cool morning air. The dog paused, ears twitching toward the iron gate ahead. Jack followed, the air carrying a faint metallic tang. Or maybe it was just memory playing tricks again. His boots sank slightly into the wet soil. The gate loomed before him, black steel, taller than he remembered, with a small square panel glinting in the fog. He brushed his fingers across it. The screen flickered to life in cold blue light, humming softly. Then came a voice, grainy, familiar, and impossible. "Identity confirmed. Welcome back, Jack." Jack froze. It was his father's voice. For several seconds he couldn't move. The speaker crackled again, and the gate began to open with a low mechanical groan. Max barked once, a cautious sound, then looked up at him, waiting for a command. Jack's mouth went dry. "Guess we're invited," he murmured. Inside, the property unfolded like a secret, finally breathing again. Now that the fog had thinned, Jack could see the design clearly. Steel and glass, clean lines half swallowed by rock and forest. Solar panels faced the ocean's glare, and glass corridors disappeared into the cliff itself. Whoever built it had known how to make something both invisible and indestructible. The front door opened automatically when Jack approached, releasing a faint hiss as the pressure seal broke. Lights flickered on in sequence along the hallway. The air inside was dry, filtered, filled with a low hum from unseen machines. Max padded ahead, cautious but curious, nails tapping softly against the stone floor. Jack followed, his hand brushing the smooth walls. Paintings and technical blueprints hung along the corridor, his father's work. He recognized Henry's neat handwriting scrawled on one of them. Hydrowave Filtration Model 7A, Pilot System. At the corridor's end, a spiral staircase led downward. Jack hesitated before descending. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. Motion sensors triggered faint overhead lights, one by one, leading him into a subterranean chamber. It was a lab, small but precise. Stainless steel counters, drawers labeled in neat block letters, old computer screens flickering faintly. Against one wall stood filing cabinets marked project records and water samples. In the center of the room, one monitor still glowed. Jack approached cautiously. The screen pulsed once, then steadied. His father's face appeared. Henry Miller looked older than Jack remembered. Hair gone silver white, eyes lined with sleepless years. Yet his expression held that same calm precision that once steadied a household and designed miracles. His voice, though faint, was steady. "If you're watching this, Jack, it means I failed to stop them." Henry's gaze wavered, but never fell. Hydrowave wasn't what it claimed to be. We were supposed to purify runoff, stop industrial waste before it reached the ocean. But they twisted it. They learned how to dilute toxins, then falsify results. They poisoned land just enough to make it measurable, just enough to later sell it as reclaimed. Jack's pulse hammered. "The worst of it," Henry continued, "is where they tested. The northern coast, near the old military range, the same area I proposed for the PTSD Rehabilitation Center. They twisted my work, Jack, turned healing into harm. The veterans were supposed to rebuild there, live there. Instead, they'll breathe what we tried to clean." Henry's breath trembled. "I collected proof, data, samples, names. They knew. They came for me. If you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it. Find the files marked Signal 9 and trust no one from Hydrowave." The video cut to static. Jack stood still, eyes fixed on the fading image. His father's voice lingered like a pulse in the air. He turned to Max, who sat beside him, gaze steady, silent as stone. "They twisted his work," Jack said quietly. "They took his honor, and ours." He began searching the drawers, finding flash drives, maps, and coded notebooks. One map showed discharge routes in red ink, a web of rivers leading to the sea. Several sites were circled, including one labeled Site R7, Veterans Rehabilitation District. Jack traced the name with his thumb. His stomach turned. The same site Henry had designed for veterans' healing, poisoned for profit. A faint vibration rippled through the floorboards. Footsteps. Someone was moving above. Jack froze. Max's ears shot up. A low growl rumbled in his throat. The sound came again, measured, deliberate, closer this time. Jack's body remembered what his mind wanted to forget. His stance tightened, muscles recalling old habits. He climbed the stairs silently, each step an echo of discipline. At the top, a figure stood in the doorway, a woman, tall and slender, holding a flashlight. The beam sliced through the dust, landing on his chest before flicking up to his face. She froze. "Wait," she said quickly, raising her hand. "I'm not armed." Jack's voice was firm. "Who are you?" She hesitated. "My name is Grace Ellison. I worked with your father, Hydrowave." She stepped into the light, and for the first time, Jack saw her clearly. Auburn hair tied back, loosely pale skin, sharp cheekbones softened by fatigue. Her clothes were worn but practical, boots dusted with mud. There were faint scars on her wrists, as if from old burns. Her expression held both intelligence and exhaustion, the look of someone who hadn't slept peacefully in years. Jack didn't relax. "You broke into his house to reminisce?" Grace winced. "No, he told me to come if he didn't make it back. Said his son would find this place eventually." Jack's heart tightened at the word son. "You expect me to believe that?" She studied his face with something between fear and relief, as if the ghost she'd been running from had finally opened the door. I know how it sounds, but your father trusted me. I was on the survey team for Project R7. I saw what they did. I still have what's left of his data. Jack caught a flash of metal, a small drive she pulled from her satchel. It's Hydrowave's internal archive, chemical orders, disposal manifests, names. Her voice faltered. There is also something else, a secondary facility inland, Project Solace. That's where the toxins originated. Jack took the drive. It felt heavier than metal should. He turned toward the window where the ocean stretched wide and gray beneath the fog. Then this isn't over, he said softly. They didn't just kill him, they buried the truth. Grace looked at him, eyes rimmed red. He believed someone would finish what he started. Max stepped forward and sniffed her boots before settling beside her. Jack allowed himself the faintest smile. If he trusts you, he said, I will too. Outside, the wind rose against the cliff, a long, hollow sound that might have been the ocean or something deeper. Henry's frozen face lingered on the dark monitor, the faint glow reflecting across the walls. And outside, the sea kept striking the rocks below, steady and unyielding, as if whispering that truth never dies in silence. Rain came hard that night, hammering the glass walls of Widow's Point in long, slanted streaks. Lightning flared somewhere beyond the horizon, washing the cliffs in momentary silver before darkness swallowed them again. Inside, Jack sat at his father's desk, the single lamp throwing an amber pool of light across stacks of papers, notebooks, and coded files. The air smelled faintly of metal and sea, and something else, the lingering weight of truth that had waited too long to be found. Grace Ellison sat nearby, her elbows on the table, scrolling through one of Henry's encrypted drives. She looked younger under the lamplight, but there was no softness in her movements. Everything about her was measured, economical. The light caught faint traces of chemical burns along her wrist, scars she didn't bother hiding anymore. I've cracked one of the folders, she murmured, typing quickly. Hydra 14. It's not a project title. It's a pipeline. Jack leaned in. Pipeline? She nodded, lips tight. Underground discharge lines leading directly into the bay, built 15 years ago under a corporate alias. The name on the contract is Serenity Partners, LLC. Jack frowned. Never heard of it. You weren't supposed to. It's one of Hydrowave's shells. They're running the same toxin Henry exposed, only now it's technically legal. They dilute it, call it trace filtration output. On paper, it's harmless. In reality, she turned the monitor toward him. The map glowed red with branching lines, each one labeled with coordinates. It's poison dressed up as paperwork. Jack's jaw tensed. The main discharge point was only a few nautical miles from Widow's Point, right where the federal PTSD rehabilitation project was set to break ground. He traced one of the lines with his finger. They poisoned the coast, then called it clean so they could build their paradise for veterans. Perfect scam. Federally funded reclamation, moral cover, and land value through the roof. Grace's eyes darkened. They call it righteous business. Jack exhaled slowly. No, it's laundering, not just money, conscience. He sat back, rubbing a hand across his beard. Henry tried to stop them. That's why they silenced him. The screen flickered as the rain outside intensified. Grace typed another command, decrypting a file at the bottom of the drive. It was a scanned page, a hand-drawn map, annotated in Henry's handwriting. At the bottom, a line in faded ink. If you need help, trust the one who once trusted me. Grace looked up. Do you know what that means? Jack stared at the sentence. The word stirred something old, a story his father had once told about a journalist who'd helped him publish environmental papers decades ago, before Hydrowave grew powerful. Grace Holloway, he said finally. Who? She used to work for the Portland Ledger, investigative reporter. She helped my father expose a waste scandal back in '05. He said she was the only person who never took a bribe and nearly lost her job for it. Grace Ellison nodded. If she's still alive, she's your only chance. Jack powered down the computer, pocketed the drive, and looked toward the window where the sea roared beneath the cliffs. Then we find her. By morning, the storm had broken. The air was cool and sharp, the horizon washed clean of fog. Jack loaded the truck while Max circled the yard, tail swishing restlessly through the damp grass. The German shepherd seemed to sense the tension, his movements tighter, his gaze flicking often toward the tree line. Grace climbed into the passenger seat, clutching a binder of Henry's decoded documents. "She won't be easy to find," she said. "Holloway vanished from public work years ago. If she's still digging, she's keeping her head down." Jack started the engine. "Good. Means she's still breathing." They drove along the coastal road for hours, the ocean flashing silver between the trees. The highway narrowed through stretches of pine forest, the wind carrying the faint cry of gulls. Around noon, they reached a small fishing town called Gravemont Bay, a place where the docks leaned like old bones and salt clung to every surface. A diner stood near the harbor, its paint peeling, the sign above the door half lit. Beacon Grill. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried fish hung thick in the air. A few locals sat hunched at the counter, their faces roughened by wind and work. Behind them, an older woman poured coffee with a rhythm that suggested she'd done it for 40 years. Grace scanned the room quietly. If Holloway's still in this area, she'd blend in. No one would think twice about an aging reporter by the sea. Jack nodded toward the woman behind the counter. "Then let's start there." He approached, the bell over the door jingling faintly behind him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. "We're looking for someone. A Grace Holloway. Used to work for the Portland Ledger. You wouldn't happen to—" The woman stopped mid-pour. Her hand trembled just slightly before she steadied it. She looked up, and for a moment, Jack saw the flash of recognition in her gray eyes. Her hair was silver, pulled into a loose bun, her skin lined by years of weather and stubbornness. "Depends who's asking," she said finally, voice low but firm. Jack held her gaze. "Name's Jack Miller. My father was Henry Miller. Hydrowave." The diner went silent for a breath. A man coughed at the far table, then went back to his plate. Grace Holloway, if that's who she was, set down the coffee pot and leaned on the counter. "I warned Henry they'd come for him," she said softly. "And now they've come for you." Jack's pulse kicked. "Then you know why I'm here?" Her eyes narrowed, slightly, measuring him the way a chess player measures her next move. "Sit down, Mr. Miller. You look like you haven't had a decent breakfast in years." He obeyed, more out of instinct than comfort. Grace Ellison joined him quietly. The older woman poured coffee for both and sat opposite, her movement steady despite the storm in her eyes. "I quit journalism years ago," Holloway said. "Too many stories ended in funerals. But Henry, he was different. He believed truth could still matter." Jack leaned forward. "He left a message, told me to trust the one who once trusted him." A flicker of pain crossed her face. "He shouldn't have. I can't protect you." "We're not looking for protection," Jack said. "Just proof." She studied him, then nodded toward the folder Grace Ellison carried. "You've got it, haven't you? Data, maps, names." Grace opened the binder, sliding one page across the table. The map labeled Hydra 14. Holloway's breath caught. "I thought they shut that system down years ago," she whispered. "They didn't," Jack said. "They renamed it, Serenity Partners. They're using it to drain toxins under the cover of PTSD rehabilitation." For the first time, Holloway's composure cracked. God help us, she murmured. They're poisoning the veterans now. Jack's voice was tight. They already did. She closed her eyes, hands trembling slightly before she clasped them together. When she spoke again, her tone was firm, the reporter returning beneath the years. Then you'll need more than outrage. You'll need evidence they can't bury. She reached beneath the counter, retrieving a weathered metal box. Inside were old flash drives, photographs, and a single envelope marked Hydrowave 2009, classified. Your father sent this to me months before he disappeared, she said quietly. Said if anything happened, someone would come asking. Jack took the envelope, his throat tight. What's in it? Everything he couldn't say in public, Holloway replied, and maybe enough to finish what he started. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant, warning. Holloway's eyes met his. You need to move fast. Serenity Partners isn't just Hydrowave's puppet. It's funded by federal grants. Once the PTSD project breaks ground, the site becomes untouchable. They'll bury every test result and call it healing. Jack felt the weight of the envelope in his hands. He looked to Grace Ellison, who nodded silently. Max pressed against his leg, tail flicking nervously. Holloway stood, her voice low but steady. Henry trusted you to finish the story. Don't prove him wrong. Jack rose slowly. I won't. As he turned to leave, Holloway added quietly, Watch your back, Mr. Miller. They're not afraid of killing the truth, only of who carries it. The rain began again as Jack stepped outside, the sea wind, biting cold. He tucked the envelope inside his jacket and looked toward the distant cliffs. Widow's Point was barely visible through the downpour, but the road to it and to justice had never been clearer. Dawn came thin and pale, filtering through the mist like the faded light of memory. The tide had receded, leaving dark ribbons of seaweed on the rocks below Widow's Point. Jack stood by the window, one hand resting on the cold glass, the other holding the envelope Grace Holloway had given him. The seal had been broken hours ago, but he kept reading and rereading the words inside, each line tightening the knot in his chest. Inside the envelope were scanned documents, letters between Henry Miller and a whistleblower within Hydrowave. There were references to Serenity Partners, shadow accounts, and something called Phase R14 Expansion. But it was a short handwritten note at the end that stopped Jack cold. If this reaches you, trust Grace. She was the only one who didn't give up on the truth. Jack knew then that his father's war was still being fought. Only now it had passed to him. He sat at the desk, the air thick with the smell of salt and old electronics. Grace Ellison was asleep on the couch, her laptop still open beside her. Max lay curled on the rug, one ear twitching at every sound outside. The dog had hardly rested since their meeting with Holloway, and Jack had learned to trust those instincts. He opened his laptop and began composing a message, one he never thought he'd write. Ms. Holloway, my name is Jack Miller, Henry's son. We met yesterday, but I've found something else. The files you gave us mentioned a journalist from 2010 who investigated Hydrowave. Her initials match yours. I believe you knew my father longer than you admitted. Please, if there's more you can tell me, I need to understand what he was really fighting. Jack Miller. He hesitated before pressing send, but something inside him, that quiet stubbornness he'd inherited from Henry, urged him forward. 2 hours later, his inbox pinged. A new message appeared, untraceable sender ID. Jack, yes, I investigated Hydrowave in 2010. I was fired before my story reached print. The government called it misinformation. Henry told me to vanish, said my safety depended on it. A week later, he disappeared too. 2 months before that, I received an anonymous package, data logs, discharge reports, signed under the name Signal 9. I'm certain it came from your father. If you are truly his son, we need to talk. They haven't stopped. In fact, Serenity Partners is expanding operations next quarter. Meet me in Portland at the old ferry terminal, 8 p.m. Come alone. GH. Jack read the message twice. He could hear his father's echo in the subtext. Trust carefully, but act decisively. He turned to Grace Ellison, who stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. Something came, he said quietly, from Holloway. She sat up, hair disheveled, the fatigue of sleepless nights tracing her face. She replied, "She says Hydrowave never stopped. Serenity's expanding. She wants to meet in Portland." Grace frowned. "At night?" She said alone. "That's not a good sign," Grace said, voice tightening. "If Holloway's right, they're monitoring communication lines. They might already know you reached out." Jack glanced toward Max, who had risen now, tail stiff, eyes focused on the door. Maybe they already do. He packed the documents and slid the gun, his father's old service pistol, into the glove box. Max trotted beside him as he loaded the truck. The sky had turned the color of bruised steel, the wind heavy with incoming rain. Grace followed him outside. "You can't just walk into this blind," she said. "At least let me tail you from a distance." Jack shook his head. "If they see you, it's over. I'll make contact, get whatever she's holding, and head north. You stay here, back up the drives, all of them." Grace looked at him for a moment, searching for a trace of hesitation. There was none. "Fine," she said softly. "But don't play the hero, Jack. Heroes die alone." He managed a thin smile. "So do secrets." Then he got in the truck, Max jumping into the passenger seat. As he drove down the narrow road, the sea faded behind him, replaced by forests thick with fog and shadows. It took nearly 2 hours to reach Portland. By then, night had fallen. The ferry terminal sat abandoned by the waterfront, a skeletal frame of steel and cracked glass. Once a bustling hub, now it smelled of rust and seaweed. A single light flickered near the end of the pier, casting ripples on the water below. Jack parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, Max padding silently beside him. The dog's ears were alert, head low, reading the invisible. A figure waited by the railing, a woman wrapped in a long dark coat, her hair silver gray and whipped by the wind. Grace Holloway looked smaller in person than Jack remembered from the diner, thinner, more fragile, as though the years had hollowed her but not broken her. "Henry's eyes," she said as he approached, her voice almost lost in the wind. "I see them in you." Jack stopped a few feet away. "You said you had more." She nodded, pulling a small waterproof case from her coat. Henry was close to exposing Phase R-14. What no one knew is that Serenity Partners is planning a full coastal expansion. They've got federal funding under a new program, environmental recovery. It's the same poison, just in cleaner packaging. Jack took the case, feeling the weight of it. What's inside? The original Signal 9 data, everything Hydrowave tried to erase. You'll need help decoding it, but it's all there, contracts, signatures, and the proof that the toxin levels were never reduced. They just changed the names of the chemicals. Lightning flared again, and in that instant, Jack saw movement beyond the far pier. A flash of black, the glint of metal. Holloway saw it too. "They followed you?" Jack turned, instinct taking over. "Move!" A black SUV roared down the dock, headlights cutting through the rain. Max barked sharply as Jack grabbed Holloway's arm and pulled her behind a stack of crates. The truck screeched to a halt, and 2 men stepped out, both tall, dressed in dark raincoats, their faces obscured by the glare of the lights. Jack didn't wait. He shoved the case into Holloway's hands. "Run!" one of the men shouted. No words, just a command. and the other raised a flashlight that wasn't a flashlight at all. The silent shot cracked through the rain, grazing the wooden post inches from Jack's head. He ducked low, rolled behind the barrier, and drew his pistol. "Stay down," he hissed. Holloway crouched beside him, breathing hard. "I told you! They never stopped!" Max lunged forward suddenly, his teeth clamping onto the leg of one of the attackers. The man yelled in shock, stumbling backward as the dog's weight threw him off balance. Jack fired once, a warning shot into the concrete that sent the other man ducking. The SUV's engine revved again. Then, silence. The figures retreated into the night as fast as they had come, leaving behind only the hiss of rain and Max's low growl fading into the storm. Holloway clutched the waterproof case to her chest. "They'll come again," she said. Jack nodded, scanning the dark horizon. "Let them. But next time, they won't find us waiting." He turned toward her. "We move before dawn. Widow's Point isn't safe anymore." She looked at him, weary, soaked, but defiant. "Your father was right," she said softly. "You carry his fire." Jack didn't answer. He only glanced down at Max, whose amber eyes gleamed in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, the storm rolled out to sea. But for Jack Miller, the war had just begun again. The morning fog hung low over the Maine coastline, soft and cold as breath against glass. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, and the world felt half awake, suspended between night and day. Jack drove in silence, the rhythmic hum of the truck blending with the sound of waves crashing somewhere beyond the pines. Beside him, Max sat upright, tail flicking once, gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. The German shepherd seemed restless, sensing something neither man nor machine could name. Jack's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. His mind replayed the night at the ferry terminal, the muzzle flashes, the smell of gunpowder, Holloway's shaking hands as she clutched the waterproof case. They had escaped by seconds, but the echo of that chase lingered like smoke in his lungs. Now, as the cliffs of Widow's Point came into view again, a sharp ache settled in his chest. "We'll be quick," he murmured to Max. "Grab the drive, then we're gone." The house stood where the rock met the sea, its glass facade glinting faintly beneath the gray sky. Yet something was wrong. The gate that had once responded to his father's voice was already ajar, one hinge bent. The hum of the security system, that faint electrical pulse he had grown used to, was silent. Max leapt out first, nose to the ground, body taut. His hackles rose. "Easy," Jack said softly, stepping through the gate. His boots crunched against the gravel, every sound carried too far. The wind off the ocean smelled sharper than usual, metal, smoke, and salt. Inside, the front door hung open, swinging lightly in the breeze. Jack stepped in, gun drawn, eyes adjusting to the dimness. The once orderly space was chaos now. Papers lay scattered across the floor, drawers torn out, the computers gutted. The spiral staircase leading down to the basement was splattered with footprints, heavy, booted, recent. He descended slowly, Max moving ahead of him, nose low. The lab below was in ruins. The walls were scorched from some kind of short circuit, and the screens were shattered. The air smelled of burnt wires and salt water. Whoever had been here knew exactly what they were looking for, and had found it. Jack's pulse quickened. He knelt by the wreckage, pushing aside twisted bits of metal. The servers were gone. The drives Henry had used to store his research had been pried from the racks, cables torn free like veins. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They cleaned it." Max sniffed near the workbench, then began scratching at the floorboards. Jack frowned, moving closer. "What is it, boy?" The dog kept digging, nails clattering against the wood. Beneath one loose panel, something metallic glinted faintly. Jack pried it open and pulled out a small steel box, roughly the size of a lunch tin, covered in a thin layer of dust. It bore a single engraving on top, Miller Engineering, Prototype Vault 3. Inside, he found a few small objects, a folded note, a brass key, and an old business card. He recognized the name instantly. Grace Holloway, though this one was older, yellowed at the edges. Scrawled beneath it, in Henry's handwriting, were 6 words. If urgent, call at dawn. Father. Jack's breath caught. His father's voice seemed to echo in his head, low and steady. Trust her when you can't trust anyone else. He pocketed the box, heart pounding. Then Max growled, low, warning. A faint whine hummed through the walls like a machine reawakening. Jack froze. The security panel above the stairs flickered to life, displaying a flashing red sequence. One line pulsed across the cracked screen. System breach detected. He turned sharply. Max, out now! They bolted up the stairs. The air had changed, thick with static, carrying a deep, rising hum. Jack threw open the door and sprinted across the gravel toward the truck. The moment his boots hit the road, a shattering explosion split the morning. The blast threw him forward, the sound swallowing everything. He hit the ground hard, the air ripped from his lungs. When his vision steadied, Widow's Point was ablaze, the house glowing like a lantern against the pale dawn. Glass shattered outward in slow motion, raining down across the rocks. The ocean below hissed as fire met salt spray. Henry, Jack whispered. Max whined beside him, ears pinned, trembling. Jack pushed himself up, every muscle screaming. The flames painted the sky orange and black, and somewhere beneath the roar of the sea, he thought he heard a low, mechanical thud, like a timed detonation deep inside the cliff. He stumbled toward the wreckage, the heat forcing him back. The house that had been his father's refuge, the last link between them, was gone. But in the wreckage, something glinted beneath the ash, a piece of twisted metal wedged between the rocks. Jack knelt, ignoring the heat, and brushed away the soot. It was part of a steel support beam, warped and blackened. Etched into it, half buried by fire, were the faint words, Montgomery Street, RF. He stared at the letters, mind racing. RF. That name, those initials, weren't random. His father had left this on purpose, a breadcrumb for him to follow. Grace Ellison had once mentioned that Henry had connections beyond Hydrowave, a circle of private consultants who had worked in environmental counterintelligence during the late 1990s. Among them was a man named Robert Fitzgerald, known for helping whistleblowers hide evidence before trials. He'd gone underground years ago after exposing a major corporate scandal. RF, Jack whispered, Montgomery Street, San Francisco. The smell of burning glass stung his nose. He turned to Max, who sat beside him, eyes locked on the flames. Looks like the old man's still guiding us, huh? The dog nudged his hand gently, tail low but steady. Jack looked back, once more at the ruins of Widow's Point. Smoke curled upward into the pale sky, drifting out toward the sea. It struck him then, how easily fire erased history, how memory could vanish into salt and wind. But the truth, his father's truth, was still alive, hidden in steel. He got into the truck, engine trembling beneath his touch. For a long moment, he watched the house burn in the rearview mirror. Then he shifted into gear, the tires crunching against gravel. The road bent westward, the ocean stretching endless beyond. Behind him, the last remnants of Widow's Point collapsed with a low rumble, the flames devoured by the tide. Ahead, the road curved toward the unknown, and somewhere, on Montgomery Street, a man waited who might finally piece the puzzle together. Jack drove until the house disappeared from view, the smoke thinning into mist. The wind through the open window smelled of salt, smoke, and iron, the scent of loss and of something beginning again. The fog over San Francisco that morning was thick as memory, blurring the world into shades of gray. The Golden Gate loomed in the distance, half swallowed by mist, while gulls drifted like pale ghosts over the bay. Jack Miller sat behind the wheel of his truck, his hands still on the steering wheel, long after the engine had gone silent. Mac sat beside him, his sable fur glistening faintly with dew, eyes steady and waiting, patient as always. Grace Ellison sat in the back seat, a tablet on her lap, glowing with the faint blue light of classified documents. "There's no mistake," she said. "RF stands for Robert Fitzgerald, retired federal witness advocate. He handled environmental whistleblower cases in the late 2000s, and one of his final clients—" She paused, turning the screen toward Jack. "Henry Miller." Jack's pulse thudded once, heavy and low. "My father," Grace nodded. "He's alive, or he was. Fitzgerald's files say he entered witness protection under the name David Moore, San Francisco, registered as a civil consultant for a maritime restoration firm." Jack stared through the windshield. The sea wind rattled the truck's door, carrying the scent of salt and iron. "So, all this time, he was here." Grace closed the tablet softly. "He didn't fake his death, Jack. They made him disappear." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "That makes it better?" Grace didn't answer. Her voice gentled. "He left because he thought he was saving you. Sometimes survival looks like betrayal." Jack didn't respond. His eyes were already distant, fixed on a point only he could see. A door, a face, a truth that hurt to believe. They found Fitzgerald's address in the old part of town, where brick buildings leaned close together and the sidewalks smelled of rain and oil. Inside the building, the walls were lined with framed degrees and yellowed newspaper clippings about whistleblowers and lost causes. The air smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Robert Fitzgerald was a tall man, with white hair combed neatly back, his once broad shoulders slightly stooped. His face was all hard edges softened by time, sharp gray eyes beneath heavy brows, and a scar that ran from the corner of his mouth down his jawline, the remnant of a long-forgotten fight. When he smiled, it looked more like regret than welcome. "Henry said you'd come someday," he said quietly. "Didn't think it would take a dozen years." Jack stood frozen for a moment, searching his face. "You knew him." "I did more than that," Fitzgerald replied. "I buried him, at least on paper." Grace frowned. "You helped stage his death." The old man nodded. "Hydrowave wasn't the only threat. The Bureau thought keeping him alive would cost too much. So they gave him a new name, a new city, a new lie. I signed off on it." Jack's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "And me? You just left me to believe. He was gone?" Fitzgerald met his eyes, steady, remorseful. "He made me promise, Jack. No contact, not even a letter. He said if you thought he was alive, you'd come looking. And looking meant dying." The room fell silent except for the faint tick of an old clock. "Where is he now?" Jack asked finally. Fitzgerald hesitated. "Pacific Heights, apartment 5C. He goes by David Moore, keeps to himself, teaches part-time at a marine research center. He still keeps his back to the wall." Jack turned toward the door, his jaw tight. "Then I'll find him." "Jack," Grace began, but he was already gone. The apartment building was old, pale stucco, with ivy crawling up the front. The bay wind moved through it like a whisper. Jack stood at the entryway, staring at the row of doorbells. His hand trembled as he pressed one. 5C. Footsteps approached from inside. The latch turned, the door opened. Henry Miller stood before him, older, smaller than memory, his once dark hair now entirely silver. His eyes, though, were the same, warm brown fading into hazel, soft and trembling with disbelief. He wore a cardigan, gray slacks, and the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment in dreams but never expected to live it. "Jack," he breathed, voice cracked and thin. Jack's mouth went dry. For a second, words refused to come. "You're alive." Henry smiled faintly, though his lips trembled. "So are you, thank God." They stared at each other for a long, aching silence. 12 years hung between them. 12 years of letters unsent, calls unmade, ghosts unburied. Finally, Henry stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was neat, small, and filled with the quiet order Henry had always kept. Shelves of books lined the walls, alongside model ships and weathered journals. A photograph of young Jack with his mother sat on the mantel, its frame polished clean. Henry poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, his hands unsteady. "I thought if I disappeared, they'd stop hunting you," he said quietly. "I thought hiding was saving." Jack's voice was low, rough. "You thought wrong. You left me with silence. You left me to think you died. For nothing." Henry looked down at the steaming cup between his palms. "You're right. I thought time would protect you, but time only punishes what it can't heal." He met Jack's eyes, and for a heartbeat, all the years fell away. "I'm sorry, son." Jack swallowed hard, his throat burning. "I should hate you. I know, but I don't." Henry's lip trembled. "Why not?" "Because I became you," Jack said quietly. "I learned what it means to hide from pain, to lose everything trying to protect what's left." The words hung heavy in the air. Then Max, who had waited patiently by the door, walked forward and pressed his nose into Henry's shaking hand. The old man froze, then laughed softly, a sound that broke, halfway into a sob. "You must be Max," he said, running his fingers through the shepherd's fur. "Henry Miller's son's shadow." Jack smiled faintly through the blur in his eyes. "He's the only one who never left." Henry reached out, hesitated, then placed a trembling hand on Jack's shoulder. "Neither did I." "Not really." Jack took his father's hand, gripping it tightly. Outside, the fog deepened until the world beyond the window was nothing but white and the faint sound of the ocean. Henry's eyes glistened as he whispered, "I thought running would save us, but I made you live 12 years in silence." Jack shook his head. "Then let's end the silence. Let's bring the truth into the light. Together." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Henry stood, his hand still holding Jack's. He looked older, yes, but lighter too, like a man finally done with ghosts. Max barked once, sharp and bright, then pressed between them, tail wagging. His warm tongue brushed Henry's wrist, breaking the last fragile distance between father and son. Henry laughed again, quiet, disbelieving. "Looks like he's claiming both of us." Jack chuckled softly. "Guess he knows family when he sees it." They stood there a long while, 2 men, a dog, and 12 years of pain dissolving into the mist that drifted through the half-open window. When Henry finally stepped forward, Jack didn't resist. The embrace was hesitant at first, then fierce, then still. A father holding the life he thought he'd lost, and a son forgiving without needing words. Outside, the fog wrapped around them, silver and soft, carrying the scent of the bay. The city below stirred awake, but inside the small apartment, time seemed to stop. Their reunion was not loud nor dramatic. It was quiet, fragile, human. Forgiveness didn't need to be spoken. It lived in the touch, the breath, the silence between them. And for the first time in 12 years, Henry Miller, or David Moore, felt whole again. The morning of the trial broke gray and cold over Washington, D.C., the air thick with the kind of stillness that comes before history changes course. The courthouse stood like a monument carved from shadow, marble columns wet with rain, flags hanging limp, and the low hum of reporters gathering by the steps. Jack Miller adjusted his tie, an act that felt both foreign and foolish. His reflection in the glass doors looked older than his 47 years, the lines on his face carved deeper by war and truth alike. Beside him, Max walked with quiet dignity, tail low but eyes bright, his presence a calming weight in the chaos. The dog's sable fur gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, and the security guards who stopped everyone else simply nodded as Jack passed. There was something about the pair, man and dog, that seemed to belong to another kind of story, one too honest to question. Inside, Grace Ellison was already there, her hair pinned back, her dark blazer crisp despite the sleepless nights that had led them here. She looked up from a folder thick with printed exhibits. EPA forensic teams confirmed everything, she said softly. The chemical compound in the samples matches Hydra 14 exactly. The dilution levels correspond to Henry's original formula, and to the falsified Serenity Partners reports. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. Then they can't deny it anymore. Behind them, Robert Fitzgerald adjusted his glasses, his face pale beneath the courtroom lights. "They'll try," he said, his voice low. "They always do, but this time they're cornered." He gestured toward the far side of the hall, where Henry Miller, or rather David Moore no longer, sat with his back straight and his silver hair combed neatly. Age had softened him, but not diminished him. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the notes before him, but his eyes were calm, the eyes of a man who had spent 12 years living in the shadows and had finally decided to stand in the sun, no matter the cost. When he saw Jack enter, he smiled faintly. "You came." Jack sat beside him, laying a hand on his shoulder. "Wouldn't miss it. You ready?" Henry exhaled slowly. "Not ready, but willing." The clerk's voice broke the quiet. "Court is now in session." The room filled with the rustle of paper, the creak of benches, the echo of footsteps as lawyers and witnesses took their places. Across the aisle sat the representatives of Hydrowave Industries, men and women in immaculate suits, their faces blank and practiced. At the center of their table sat Richard Clay, Hydrowave's current CEO, tall, lean, late 50s, with a cold precision in his eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. His tailored navy suit looked more like armor than clothing. When he glanced at Henry, there was no recognition, only irritation, as if an old ghost had returned to ruin a carefully rebuilt empire. Henry met that gaze, without flinching. The proceedings began with Grace testifying first. She spoke calmly, laying out the timeline of events, the leak of toxic runoff along the Maine coastline, the whistleblower files recovered from Hydrowave's servers, the internal memos referencing Serenity Partners' shell accounts. Her voice, though steady, carried the quiet fury of someone who had lost too much to silence. When the defense tried to discredit her for her dismissal in 2010, she only smiled. "Yes, they fired me," she said, "right after I found the documents you're now calling fabricated. Funny timing, isn't it?" A few people in the audience chuckled softly. Even the judge's lips twitched. Next came Fitzgerald, explaining the legal labyrinth that had hidden Henry for more than a decade. He detailed the federal protection orders, the manipulation of evidence, the conflicts of interest that had tied government agencies to Hydrowave's campaign contributions. His voice was tired but resolute, each word striking like the toll of a slow bell. Then, at last, Henry Miller took the stand. He stood carefully, the weight of years evident in every motion, and swore his oath with a hand that trembled only slightly. The courtroom hushed. "My name," he began, "is Henry Miller. 12 years ago, I was lead engineer at Hydrowave's Environmental Division. My job was to develop a system for filtering ocean pollutants. What we found was a way to disguise them instead." He paused, looking down at his notes, though he didn't need them. His memory was sharper than anyone expected. They called it Hydra 14, a formula that diluted toxins just enough to pass regulatory tests. But the poison didn't vanish. It traveled. It settled in the groundwater, in the soil, in the blood of the same veterans they claimed to help through their healing centers. Gasps rippled through the room. Henry reached into the evidence folder before him, retrieving a small flash drive. "This," he said quietly, "is the recording I made the night before I disappeared." The clerk connected it to the courtroom monitor. The video flickered to life, grainy footage of a younger Henry speaking into a camera in his old Hydrowave office. His voice was calm, his eyes tired. "If this reaches anyone, it means I failed to stop them. They'll tell you it's about rehabilitation, about care for the broken. But they're breaking people twice, first in war, then in peace. The same chemicals they claim to cure trauma are poisoning the ground these soldiers come home to. And someone needs to say it." When the video ended, silence fell like a shroud. Even the defense attorneys seemed unsure what to do. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied back in a braid, finally spoke. "Proceed." Henry looked toward the Hydrowave table. "I stayed silent too long," he said softly, "because I thought fear was safer than truth. But fear builds cages. Truth builds graves, unless we use it right." By the time he stepped down, there were tears in more than one pair of eyes. When the verdict came days later, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras flashing like lightning. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. Hydrowave Industries and its subsidiaries are found guilty of environmental destruction, data manipulation, and federal contract fraud. Assets totaling $4.3 billion will be seized and reallocated under the Haven Foundation Act for Marine Restoration and Veteran Rehabilitation. A collective murmur spread through the crowd. Disbelief, relief, something like hope. Outside the courthouse, rain began to fall again. Henry stood on the steps beside Jack and Grace, his breath visible in the chill air. Fitzgerald spoke with officials near the curb, his face pale but smiling for the first time in years. Henry turned to his son. "You did it, Jack. You finished what I couldn't." Jack shook his head. "No, Dad. We did it." Henry's eyes softened, the weight of 12 years lifting from his shoulders. "Then let's make sure what we built today isn't forgotten tomorrow." He took Jack's hand, his grip steady. "You've carried my ghost long enough, son. Now live for those who didn't make it back, for the men still fighting battles no one sees." Jack nodded, his throat too tight for words. Max leaned against his leg, looking up at them both with quiet devotion. Behind them, the courthouse bells began to ring, not in mourning, but in reckoning. The city lights shimmered through the rain, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt clean again. Morning came quietly to the Maine coast, carrying with it the clean scent of salt and pine. Where once there had been ruin, scaffolding now climbed skyward. Where silence had reigned, the sound of hammers, laughter, and gulls now filled the air. A year had passed since the verdict that broke Hydrowave's empire, and Widow's Point, once the site of secrecy and fire, had begun its slow rebirth. The sea below glimmered pale blue, gentle for the first time in years. Wooden beams framed a wide courtyard overlooking the cliff, and a new sign hung over the gate, wrapped in canvas to await its unveiling. The people working here were not contractors or hired crews. They were veterans, fishermen, widows, and wanderers. The forgotten had returned to rebuild something that could remember them. Jack Miller walked among them, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his beige shirt streaked with sawdust and salt. The lines on his face had softened. The old sharpness of survival had turned into steadiness, a quiet endurance. He no longer carried a weapon at his hip, just a wrench and the occasional smile. Max trotted beside him, tail wagging, a faded blue bandana tied loosely around his neck. He was older now, with more gray around his muzzle, but his eyes still held that same amber fire. Children from nearby towns often visited to feed him treats or watch his training sessions. To them, Max was no longer just a dog. He was the symbol of the place, loyal, patient, unbroken. The Haven Center was a hybrid of workshop, therapy space, and marine research facility, a blend of Henry's design and Jack's discipline. Large glass panels faced the ocean, powered by wind turbines Henry had engineered decades ago. Rainwater flowed through a natural filtration garden at the edge of the property, Henry's old hydrowave prototype, resurrected and cleansed of its shame. Inside, veterans worked side by side with locals, sanding wood, teaching welding, building prosthetics, and fixing fishing equipment for nearby harbors. There was laughter here, and something rarer, trust. Henry Miller, his hair now a full crown of silver, walked slowly along the deck with his cane, his once engineer's hands now steadier than they had been in years. His posture had bent a little, but his eyes were alive with purpose again. He wore a faded windbreaker with the logo of the Haven embroidered on the chest, and whenever someone greeted him as "Sir," he'd chuckle and say, "I'm just the old ghost who finally came home." Grace Ellison, still reporting, but now on her own terms, had become the chronicler of Haven's progress. She was often seen with her camera slung around her neck, interviewing the veterans who worked there. She had cut her hair shorter, a gray streak at the temple she never bothered to hide. "Truth ages better when you stop polishing it," she once told Jack. One afternoon, a small ceremony took place on the rebuilt platform overlooking the sea. Locals gathered with paper cups of coffee, boots muddy from construction. Fitzgerald stood beside the mayor, holding a sealed envelope, final documentation transferring all hydrowave assets officially to the Haven Foundation. He smiled faintly at Henry. "Your idea survived bureaucracy. That might be a miracle." Henry laughed softly. "No, that's just stubborn people refusing to die." As the cloth covering the new sign was pulled away, sunlight struck the polished brass letters. The Haven, for the brave, the broken, and the sea. Applause rose, mixed with the cry of gulls and the crash of surf below. Jack stepped forward, one hand resting on Max's head. "We built this place to give people something they were told they'd never get back," he said. "Hope." When the crowd dispersed, leaving behind only the hush of waves, Henry remained by the railing, looking out toward the horizon. Jack joined him quietly, two silhouettes framed by the sea and the scent of cedar. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Henry said, "Do you remember what this view used to look like?" Jack nodded. Smoke and silence. Henry smiled faintly. "Now it's life." The wind tugged gently at their jackets. Henry's gaze lingered on the water, his voice quiet but certain. "You see, Jack, the sea's blue again, not because time healed it, but because kindness did." Jack rested his hands on the railing, eyes soft with thought. "You faked your death to save the truth," he said slowly. "Now we live to save what people still believe in." Henry's hand trembled slightly as it found Jack's shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted for you." Max barked once, a sharp sound that echoed off the cliff. He leaned against Jack's leg, tail swaying, as if urging both men to look toward the water. Down below, sunlight spilled across the waves, reflecting an endless motion, bright, patient, alive. Later that evening, as lanterns flickered across the deck and laughter drifted from the workshop, Jack sat beside Max on the steps. The dog rested his head on Jack's knee, eyes half closed. Beyond them, the horizon burned gold, then softened into lavender. Henry's voice carried softly through the air from where he stood near the edge. "It's strange," he murmured, "how something broken can hold so much light." Jack smiled, eyes on the sea. "Maybe it's not strange at all." Henry turned toward him. "You think the haven will last?" Jack looked around, at the veterans' tightening beams, at Grace scribbling in her notebook, at the younger volunteers planting dune grass along the cliffs. "Yeah," he said simply, "because it was built by people who already know what loss feels like. They won't forget." Henry's eyes softened. He tilted his head toward Max. "And what about him?" Jack reached down, scratching the dog's fur. "He's our first therapist. Doesn't take appointments, but he's never late." The old man laughed, the sound light and unguarded. As dusk deepened, the waves below caught the last streaks of sunlight, scattering them across the bay. The reflection reached all the way to the cliffside, shimmering up the rock face, touching the brass sign that gleamed in quiet pride. The haven, for the brave, the broken, and the sea. Henry whispered almost to himself, "Looks like we finally built something honest." Jack turned to him, voice low. "No, Dad. You built something that lasts." The wind carried the smell of salt and cedar and coffee from the mess hall. Somewhere a guitar played, one of the younger veterans singing softly into the night. For the first time in decades, Widow's Point was not a place of endings. It was a beginning. The sea murmured below them, no longer poisoned, no longer silent. And as the lights of Haven glowed across the cliff, Max lifted his head and gave one small bark, as if to remind them both. Sometimes, the truest miracles don't arrive in thunder. They come back quietly, like the tide. And so, as another dawn broke over Widow's Point, the waves carried more than the scent of salt. They carried a promise. What began as ruin had become redemption. What started as a secret buried in the dark had risen into light that reached far beyond the cliffs. The haven was no longer just a center for healing. It was a living parable. Here, soldiers found peace not through forgetting the past, but by rebuilding the world they once fought to protect. Here, fishermen, widows, and wanderers learned that faith is not about escaping storms. It's about learning to build together while the rain still falls. Henry's machines filtered the sea again, but it was kindness that filtered hearts. Grace's words carried across screens and papers, reminding people that truth can take 12 years or 12 lifetimes. But it always finds its way home. And Jack, standing by the railing each morning, with Max at his side, had finally become what his father once dreamed of. A man who didn't just survive the fire, but built light from it. In every corner of Haven, from the sound of laughter to the hum of tools, something sacred lingered. The quiet miracle of people choosing hope over fear and faith over silence. Miracles aren't always thunder from heaven. Sometimes they are the hands that rebuild what hatred tried to destroy, the prayer whispered before dawn, the kindness that refuses to die. When you believe in grace, every act of love becomes a spark of the divine. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs light today. Leave a prayer in the comments, subscribe to keep these stories of faith and second chances alive. And may God bless you and your loved ones. May your days shine with the same quiet courage that rebuilt Widow's Point.